Hello, folks. I'm Jay Rajendran, Product Marketing Manager at Firebolt. Today, we will review Data Team's outlook on data warehousing for 2023. This session is based on a survey of data teams across select industries. The survey focused on understanding data-related challenges, data growth, performance, how data warehousing technologies are evaluated, and what is on the card for 2023. So we'll be sharing a link to the survey at the end of the session. To discuss the findings, I'm joined today by a panel of industry experts. What I love about our panel is that they are practitioners who deal with data day in and day out. So having said that, I wanted to go through a quick set of intros. Mark Rittman, from CEO of Rittman Analytics. Mark, if you want to go ahead and quickly introduce yourself.
Hi there. Hi, I'm Mark. I'm CEO of Rittman Analytics. As I said, I've been doing data warehousing now for about 25 years. From days of kind of Oracle and Teradata and those kind of products through to Firebolt today, and like BigQuery and so on. So really pleased to be on this panel, and it should be an interesting conversation. Ben.
Oh, sure. I was
we
were going to go in order. But
yeah.
Hey everyone. My name is Ben Rogojan, aka the Seattle data guy. I help companies kind of set up their data stacks, and as well as plan out and act out their data strategies. Also do a lot of content creation on top of that. So.
Hey folks, I'm Archana. I lead data at Eventbrite. What that is the engineering, the analytics, and the data science, put it all together and try to figure it out end to end so that we're solving problems for our customers and internal business needs.
Thank you, folks. So let's dive right in. So first, we wanted to just talk to you about the data-related challenges that you're seeing, right? So maybe we can start with you, Archana, in this case. So since you have a customer-facing data analytics program that you run, maybe we can start there. What kind of challenges are you seeing today? What is important to you guys?
I think the key is really driving insights rather than data back in the hands of whether it's customers or internal customers and decision makers. And that goes back to, do we have the right infrastructure that is responsive so people don't give up in even trying to engage with data? And once we can and do engage with data, how do we get the so what from what we see in the data quickly and in the right way, interpreting it with all the necessary context end to end? That, I would say, is the biggest challenge. And it's not only a technology solution. In my mind, there's an element of enablement and process that has to go hand in hand alongside any data infrastructure that we roll out.
Yeah, so as a follow-up, I think one of the things that I see as a challenge in the data space is that things change so rapidly, right? There are so many things to dealing with. Infrastructure is one component. Tool sets are changing. There's a skills shortage. I guess, how do you all reconcile across all these different things? How do you manage it? Maybe Mark, if you want to take that.
Yeah, maybe I could take that question, or I could be a politician and answer the question. Maybe I was going to answer. Think about this. I mean, go back to your bit you had before. There, you talked about challenges and cost is a challenge, right? And I'd say working at scale efficiently is a challenge, really. So I mean, cost. It's very easy these days to work with kind of analytics platforms and particularly data warehouses, get started very quickly, and the absolute cost is still minimal compared to the costs that I'm used to paying in the old days of using like big on-premises enterprise data warehouses. But managing the cost of your platform, particularly now with budgets being so sort of like under scrutiny, is an issue as far as I'm concerned, really. And certainly that's the kind of feedback we get from our clients, and also performance as well. I mean, it's as we start to do things at scale, and as we start to get into the kind of multi-terabytes and so on, actually getting your query performance to come, queries to come back in a reasonable time is not a trivial thing, and it's not a given thing. And so getting a reasonable performance out of your data warehouse and your platform is important, particularly if you're trying to increase adoption and show the value of what you're doing. So, really, they're the challenges that I see. Maybe Ben can answer the ones you talked about, but certainly for me, what we're seeing is price and performance are big issues for clients.
Okay. Ben, anything from your side?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of challenges, often the things that I've come into, and this could be just what am I looking for the word? Just the nature of the beast of being a consultant. The challenges I generally see are around, just one, a combination of like trustworthiness in terms of data. That there's still a lot of people who struggle in when they look at the data, either because of previous people who have built their reports, they're still not really relying on it, and they're going and circumventing whatever is developed in the data warehouse their team is currently relying on. And then the other one is just, kind of like handoffs between, teams as people kind of pass on and you hire new employees, and, what was once built is now often rebuilt over and over again. And so there's a lot of like, I don't know, patterns in that regard where people seem to keep rebuilding the same thing and never truly solving the problems that their stakeholders are asking to get solved.
So thanks, folks. Let's look at the survey results itself, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it, right? So obviously these are things that, as Mark mentioned, price and performance seem to be challenges there. I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, how does this reflect the reality that you folks see out there? Is there anything that weighs more, in your opinion, than others?
Just on one point for me, I mean, looking at operational overhead there, I mean, that's something that I hear people talking about and being a concern about, modern data stack and generally, I suppose, like you say, like Ben said, custom built solutions. So bringing down the operational overhead for your data warehouse such that you can then use your resources for something more valuable is important. I mean, the message I'm hearing from people all the time now is next year is all about getting more from less, really. So anything that can reduce the operational burden for your platform is very welcome at the moment.
So I guess a follow-on question, right? So what are people doing to manage cost more effectively?
Well, again, just to carry on with that, really, it's interesting that one of the sort of sayings I often say is nobody under the age of 40 has ever tuned a database to query before, or has had to kind of like, I suppose, squeeze their queries and their workload into a fixed kind of set of resources. Because in the old days, you used to be limited by the amount of servers you can get in your server room, but now there is no limit to how much you can spend on a cloud platform. So there is a greater understanding these days of, things aren't free, and you have to kind of understand how your platform works, and not, your one size fits all platforms aren't necessarily the ones that are going to kind of work at scale, but they won't necessarily work economically at scale. So understanding how things work and being able to tune and optimize queries on your database will be hopefully a rediscovered art.
I kind of disagree with that, right? I think, in many ways, everything becoming commoditized and easier. I mean, for the folks who are getting value out of the data sitting in these big databases, like, should they spend their cycles figuring out how to optimize their queries? No, I think the platform should just be much better at auto-tuning and doing that optimization. And we need to push that burden further down the stack. And for people buying these, data warehouses and signing contracts with them, like, they shouldn't have to worry about the stuff under the hood, because that takes away from the value that the business or the customers would get out of the investments being made. The whole point is these are supposedly scaling elastically, like for me, having a managed service pays off better than, I could have imagined if I spent those cycles personally sitting and trying to figure out, how to revamp everything that we have for the questions we want to be able to ask in the future, which we may not even know.
So I guess the question, a follow-up, Archana, is that what you're saying is maybe you view certain things as undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? That maybe you want to avoid. But I guess the thing that I want to ask is, all the customers that we surveyed, they're all on the cloud. They all use managed services, but pricing is still an issue for them, right? Yep. So I guess my question is there something inherently that are there things that they need to be aware of in the pricing models in the cloud, right? not all pricing models are alike. So is there a flaw there on that side that people need to be more conscious of?
Yeah, I think I see where you're going with this train of thought. I also kind of want to take a step back and zoom out and say it has to go back to total cost of ownership. Does, how much I spend on my data warehouse take away from burden, operational burden, or, kind of all things legacy and maintenance management that I'm modernizing away from? And, are people looking at that equation holistically? I agree, pricing is a huge concern, but is that a side effect of growth in the amount of data? And is there more that can be done with, like, well, maybe that's a good thing. That means my business is successful and growing. And so, yeah, we just have to kind of set aside X amount as a side effect for, getting the value from the data that's helping the growth, right? And it's that flywheel and a natural side effect of that more than anything else.
Fair enough. So on that front, right, let's switch to the next slide. Let's talk about growth, because I think, the challenges that we talked about basically get worse, right, if growth is an issue. So the question that we see is that, here, obviously, we're seeing in a 40% plus in a CAGR, right? So is this normal in the data world? Is this normal, or is it too much,
I mean, I think it's that unavoidable future that we have, right? Like data has been growing at an exponential rate for the last, whatever decade or so. And I like, Mark, that you brought up earlier, thinking about, decades ago when we were worried more about bits and bytes. And if you were managing a database, you were like, how many, in this one column, if I put it, it's 8 bytes, how long will it take before we run out of space in this database? And I think we've gone from that into a world of, we don't care about bits and bytes, we care about terabytes, or gigabytes. It's like, okay, if I'm processing X amount, is this the most effective way? So I think it's kind of somewhere in the middle between both of the statements made earlier, where it's like, it's not too much, but we do have to figure out how to make sure we're only looking at what we need, versus like, let's just look at all of it. It's like, well, we probably can only handle so much of it, and it needs to align with the business. Maybe we can store it because storage is cheap, and at this point you can store terabytes upon terabytes for almost nothing. But being a little more maybe thoughtful in terms of maybe what you're processing. If you don't need to process it, then don't. So I think to some degree it's unavoidable, because we want all these answers. We have all these questions.
Yeah. So when you look at these numbers, though, right? It's every couple of years the total amount of data that you manage, doubles. It's almost like, so when you think of it, I have a price performance issue, and then the data volumes are growing. At what point do you cry uncle, right? I mean, it's too much to handle, kind of thing. But I hear what you're saying. Maybe you focus on the data that is truly valuable. Maybe you keep that. But do you see any techniques like lifecycle management, anything that customers have done out there that actually does help kind of flatten the effect of data growth? Anything at all? Anybody doing that?
I mean, I'm starting to see people discovering the art of summarization and so on. I mean, I think it's, again, going back to my thing about optimizing queries, it's surprising how little time is spent on basic things like creating not indexes as such, and that's a 5-bolt thing, but summarizing data and so on. So I think it's inevitable that data will grow in volume as more and more of our lives gets digitized and datified and so on. The amount of data available to us will be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But also, I think the other way is people are realizing there is a cost to managing data, and that cost isn't just the cost of storing it and processing it; it's the cost of actually holding it securely and having and being trusted for that data. So the more data you've got under your management, the bigger responsibility there is as well.
So I guess another question, right? I mean, so are existing technologies measuring up when it comes to dealing with the growth, right? Do you feel like you have all the tools you need? Maybe, Archana, maybe, I don't know how you feel about taking that.
Yeah, I think it's, managing growth is one side of it, but going back to Mark's point, I think we do have a situation where people have trouble letting go of the past. So there's, like hoarding data from more than 10 years ago that most likely you won't need. So why not just, summarize it or throw it in cold storage and not worry about it? Like, that's such a difficult switch for people to make. And that's, I think, partly a side effect of everyone used to storage being cheap. And, to your point, like, there is a cost to that, right? Whether it's from a security standpoint or from a compliance regulatory standpoint, like, is it worth it to keep some of that if you haven't touched it in over 10 years? What are the chances that's the data that's going to matter for your business going forward, right? And I think, that's kind of treating it as a full life cycle management thing for the data. And I think that should also go to, what we collect, being intentional about collecting things that matter and will have a purpose, and collecting it in a way that also makes it easier to manage the life cycle of that data and connect it with other data that we might already have. I think that's how I think about it, as like a holistic thing rather than, yes, data is growing, but it's not so much that we should slow the growth. It should be, we should intentionally shape how it grows and why it grows.
It's interesting that of the three kind of, I suppose, different verticals there, the least kind of ethical is the one that has had the biggest kind of data growth over the years, really. I mean, certainly, or the one that is most sort of like accused of holding data for no reason, really, or not. So it's and I suppose marketing data is more likely to be sort of bigger and so on. But it's certainly, I think the trend, certainly in Europe, has been a bit more about, like you say, intentionally capturing it and storing it, really. But then again, the temptation is, well, why throw it away if you got it? That's the, what if you need it? That's the thing.
Yeah, very hoarderish, like.
Yes.
Someday you might see value. You never know.
Never.
Or it could be, or it could be the data that you leak, and then that's reputationally terrible. So really our strategy is always to have the minimum amount of data, really, because make sure you need it. If you need it, store it properly and be able to process it at volume.
Yeah,
but
makes sense.
Honestly, like, how much does a marketing or ad agency have get value out of knowing about my purchasing behavior, in my teens or in my 20s for what I do today and how they should target me?
Well, it could be useful because, I mean, I'm actually, just before this call, I was doing some analysis on calculating first channel, first product, first whatever for a customer. And if you're a bank, for example, and you're looking to get someone for their entire lifetime, then the way you were acquired is in some respects is kind of important. But then that could be summarized. You don't need to have all the transactions for somebody for the last 20 years to know what the first transaction was.
That's fair.
Cool. So switching gears, right? So now, we looked at data growth. How do we look at performance? I think that's the next question. So I think query response times are typically a good way to look at, everybody would agree on what performance looks like based on that, right? So I guess the question for you folks is, in your world, what is expected versus reality when it comes to query response times? There are other factors, obviously, with performance, but I wanted to just get some thoughts from you on that. Anybody?
I think it depends on the use case in the context, isn't it? So if it's in app analytics, then it's got to be sub-second, really. If it's a one-off piece of analysis that is complex, then minutes can be okay. But in my experience, anything more than a minute is unacceptable, really, to be honest, for end users. But it does depend on the context and the use case, really.
Have you seen that change, right? I mean, are we seeing more use cases which are driving that, really, really fast response times?
Well, it's interesting that in my 20 years of doing this, I've seen response times getting slower over time. I mean, back in the old days of OLAP cubes and kind of that sort of thing, you'd consistently get response times of less than a second. But I think as we've moved to the cloud and we've got used to distributed query, people have got more tolerant, I think, of slower response times. But it kills engagement with your dashboards and reports. So we should always be aiming for as fast as we can, really.
So I guess go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, although I agree with that, we should be engaging as fast as we can. Honestly, there's a level of impatience that's been built also, right? For most of the dashboards, frankly, real time, when people ask for real time, it's, if data is as fresh as the last hour, that's probably good enough for the questions that I'm trying to answer. So like directionally correct is okay for most things, other than if you're trying to keep the lights on during like holiday shopping demand or something like that. So I think it again goes back to, what is the business trying to solve for? And is it like always on, always snappy that matters? Or like when we need it, we are able to achieve that performance. And for most other things, it doesn't really have to be as snappy as people say they need it.
Is that not two things though? You've got the latency of the data, so how frequently it's refreshed. And I agree with you that unless you've got you're controlling, like maybe you're doing a self-driving car or something, then latency is an issue. But is this not really about the response time of the query? And it's more about how long do you want to wait to get the response back to the question you've asked? Because in my experience, it's people like to follow their train of thought. And if every new question takes 5 minutes to answer, that's the issue. I mean, latency is like you say, latency is not the issue really.
So I think it's two things. Do you want a quick answer or do you want an accurate answer? And most of the time, like, for the ones that need an accurate answer, you probably don't need a quick answer. But I don't think query engines today do a good enough job letting users decide or analysts decide which way they need it.
A slider for degree of incorrectness to the answer. Yeah.
So let's go and look at what the survey came out to be, right? And I wanted to get your thoughts on this as well. So obviously there's an expectation to have less than a minute, response time for most cases, right? But then on an average, the delivery is not there. It's taking more than a minute, right? So obviously this seems to be a challenge for folks. The question that I have is, given the amount of growth and these performance expectations, what kind of investments can you make, right, to deliver on these expectations? I know, Mark, you mentioned, hey, what, you did OLAP before. Are you seeing other things come on the horizon in terms of like the market itself, right? That could help people close the gap from a performance standpoint.
Most of it, again, as a consultant, and I'm sure Ben probably sees the same. Yeah, most of the work you can, the most high impact work you can do typically in this area is just to pre-calculate some aggregates. Really, I mean that is a big thing. There's obviously things around in memory and so on, but most of the work I see, the highest value we see is the simple simplification of queries and pre-calculating things. There are technologies out there. Firebolt's obviously one, and you've got Materialize, others. And they really can help, but especially in the case of embedded analytics. But most of the work, if you've sent me in to do this, I would just look at it and say, I bet you've not pre-calculated things.
Yeah, I'd say for a lot of clients earlier this year, I'd say I could spend like the first few weeks looking at what they were doing. And if their complaint was like, oh, my Looker dashboard takes 8 minutes, I could be like, I can almost assure you I can bring it down to a few seconds or a second. Just because oftentimes they're doing like views on views on views on views, where it's like, yes, you're running like 30 queries to calculate this one dashboard. And honestly, if you just pre-calculated some of it or looked at a cluster key or, very, very minimal things were often required. Because I think a lot of things get built as one-offs, where it's just like a quick dashboard, and either over time the data gets bigger or no one really considered performance long-term. And it usually doesn't take too much to get you to just that little bit of speed that you need. The other ongoing joke that I had with someone was, it's like you could maybe fire one employee and just crank up your size of data warehouse cluster, and suddenly your performance issues are fine and you're not spending that much more. So more of an ongoing joke, but it's another possible solution.
So I guess the question is, query response time is one thing, right? I mean, what other metrics do you folks track? Does concurrency matter? Does QPS matter? A freshness of data is something that Mark, you mentioned, right? Obviously, that's one aspect of it. What other metrics do you folks actually track? Are there other
Correct.
Well, I
metrics?
think-
Right,
Correct.
data quality matters as well, right? Is the stuff coming in correct, complete, useful is the other piece. And actually going back to Ben's earlier point, I mean, it's appropriate and important to optimize and summarize data once we know like what people want in those summaries, right? And if there is a Looker dashboard, then it's easier to figure out how to make it snappier. But part of the problem is in most circumstances, there isn't a set of agreed upon metrics that matter. And so that ties back to Jay, like your question around what are people tracking? It should depend on what the business is trying to track and then back into the data from there, rather than the other way around. Like you could have strong, awesome, complete, correct, fast, snappy data, but if it doesn't tell you anything about your customers or whatever questions are coming up, so what?
Makes sense. Thank you. So switching gears, now we are, we talked about performance. Now let's get into data warehouse selection criteria. So we asked customers, what are the top considerations in choosing data warehouse technologies? And these are the results that we got. How do you folks view these? I mean, does it map to what you would expect in an evaluation criteria?
Not really. I mean, security is a kind of a statement of the obvious, really.
Absolutely.
It's kind of one assumes that it's secure. Free trial is interesting. I mean, actually, it would surprise you, wouldn't it? How much of a choice is based on Actually, no, that's much free trial, but how kind of discoverable and how easy was it to get started with that technology? I mean, for many years I used BigQuery because actually it's a really kind of like easy tool to use and to adopt. And Firewall obviously is good in that area as well. But some of these things like decoupled storage and compute, I mean, I'm surprised that would be. I don't think if you're a salesperson for any of these database engines, you'd go out there and be selling it on that. So it's interesting for me. It's much more down to easy to maintain costs and performance. Really, other ones I think are a bit of an odd choice.
Do you think easy to implement and in a ease of maintenance, they don't matter as much because everything is offered as a managed service? Those things don't matter as much. I'm trying to see the reasoning.
Yeah, it depends what you talk about. If you're talking about the actual, again, back in the day, you'd be actually sitting there and you'd be extending table spaces and you would be doing all that. I mean, nobody wants to do that now. But then actually what you do with the database, how easy it is to create roles and manage security and maybe sort of, spin up a new schema for some development. Those sort of things I think are really important.
Yeah.
I agree 100% on that piece of it. The other thing I'm surprised not to see here is like ease of self-service for a broader set of users, whether it's analysts or anyone else who will be engaging with the data.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I guess one thing that surprised us is costs don't, I mean, even though price is a challenge, right? I think we saw that costs are a challenge, but costs don't come on top, right? I guess, why is that? What do you think that is?
I think people right. It's if you look at the pricing tables and estimators for the various database warehouse platforms, you can never really look at that and say that's what it's going to cost me. You have to sort of like use it and see what your usage is like and so on. And I think and also because price isn't really stated up front. Back in the old days, you would pay several million for term licenses, so you knew exactly what the cost was. But because it's based on your usage and that cost will emerge over time, it's probably less of an issue initially, but it should be it should be something that people think about. Really, it's probably the most important thing at a certain point.
Fair enough. And ecosystem integrations, any take on that? What does that look like from your standpoint out there? How mature is it?
I can answer that. Let someone else speak. Yeah, let someone else speak.
So my take on it, it does matter a lot just in terms of like turnkey to integrate with other data tools that we use internally. And it's, just saves so many cycles from a development standpoint if there is an ecosystem we could pull from or integrate with.
Yeah, and I think it goes in all directions, right? Like once you start looking for the solutions, it's like it's not just the data warehouse. It's like, okay, but what what can connect with this, right? Like, okay, does my, BI layer connect with it? If I've already picked my data warehouse solution, then that kind of determines what you pick in the other direction. So I feel like data warehouse tends to be where a lot of people start. So usually it's that first, and then it's like, okay, now what can I pick because I've selected this solution. So.
And it
Fair
also ties back to cost, like overall total cost, right? Because, I could either spend developer hours in building those integrations, or it's just a configuration. And then how easy is it to maintain and manage that configuration is what it would come back to.
Soon. I was gonna say, I think a recent example of why one of my clients picked the solution they did was they had some specific requirements, such as they needed government regions in terms of where they were actually running their data warehouses, as well as some external regions like Australia, and they also needed data sharing, which I think has been another feature that for some people has been really important, because you can just now, instead of having to send a copy and add this extra infrastructure of SFTP or S3 where you're sending out data, you can now just say hey, I'll just share the tables that you need access to, and you can join from there. So I think those have been some interesting features that pushed to specific solution selections.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ben. Let's switch go a little bit deeper, right? The next one was on key data analytics features that folks value. So these are the things that we found, right? Basically, there's a lot of focus on SQL. I know, Ben, you have a love-hate relationship with SQL. I don't know. What's your take on this in terms of why is SQL so popular? Can it do everything? Where is it headed?
Yeah, I mean, my love-hate with SQL, I think, is more just because the more you use it, the more there's always those little things that will, catch you. So, I am, I think, more of a traditional data management person. Thus, SQL is still one of my personal, favorites when it comes to using tools versus, people who tend to prefer a Pandas or something, data frame approach. I think, if you're a person who likes thinking about data in sets and set theory, you're always going to kind of lean towards SQL. And I think it is more of a business person language where you can kind of think about things in abstractions that make sense. So I think SQL is going to a place where it's just more accessible in terms of hey, I can now parse JSON or, other things that maybe were more difficult in the past. So now I can answer, I don't need to write Python to parse that. But I still think it comes down to making the data so it you don't have to make analysts do that. I think, you still want people to, interact with SQL at a level that's pretty basic, and they're not having to do all this crazy parsing just to get to whatever they're trying to access, because that's just more and more error prone as you kind of push that. So it's great from a data engineering perspective because you can parse it, clean it, make it nice for analysts, but it's definitely something that once you cross that, you probably want to remove too much parsing from end users.
Anything, Mark or Archana, on the ANSYS SQL compliance stuff, portability, I guess?
SQL's here to stay, right? I don't think it'll ever go away. Just like we can never get rid of Excel. As much as we try with all the fancy BI tools, you will still see Excel running many businesses.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's interesting looking at that list and in some respects how unambitious it is, really. So you've got ANSYS SQL compliance. I mean, really, is that really what people are dreaming of? Really, I mean, it's that. I mean, that's table stakes, really. And I agree that SQL is it's the cockroach, isn't it, of kind of of analytic technologies that it will be there at the end of time, still there, kind of, because it does a job really well. And it's interesting how it's seen off the likes of NoSQL, it's seen off things like MDX, it's all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting. It's the one that it's probably the skill that I learned years ago that is the most valuable skill I've ever had in my career over all this time, really. I think auto scaling is interesting because that's one that is again, that's like costing, isn't it? That you only miss that when you haven't got it, really, and that can make things very interesting. Streaming has been the one that surprised me how little impact that's had over time, really. And maybe that's back to the comment about real time not being necessarily the most important thing for data sets, but JSON support, I mean, that's kind of, and isn't it sad to see machine learning popping up the table there at the bottom, the great kind of the great hope of analytics over all these years, and there it is, two places down from JSON support. That's pretty sad, isn't it, really?
I guess it
I
comes
would
down to
say sorry, like machine learning, is it really an analytics feature? Or like you need to know how to munge the data to prepare it for then machine learning algorithms. I don't know how much of that is like innovation on the machine learning side versus just knowing how to use what already exists, right? So
I have another follow-on question, right? So machine learning, I think it's at the bottom of the list, but you see all the vendors talking about, AutoML, being able to embed that into the data warehouse. What's your view on that, right? Is it the right place to do it, right? Do you put it in the data engineering team's hands? Or
I think it's nice. I think it's handy, right? In certain database platforms, the fact there are machine learning functions in there and capabilities around that, around statistics and machine learning, is very useful. You can train a model, you can kind of then run that and so on. That's very good. But they're quite different. I mean, in terms of the teams involved in this, they're quite different sort of skill sets quite often, and so it's not an area that we do. The other thing about it is people don't realize how much data you do need to make this work, to make this work properly. Anyway, we've all moved on now to ChatGPT and AI now, which actually is interesting, actually showing you actually how this stuff, when you productize it and actually see it working in that way. I think I can see all us consultants being out of a job soon with ChatGPT there as answering our questions.
Yeah, that's funny.
So my thoughts on that, I think it's data engineering teams shouldn't be worrying about, or shouldn't have to worry about the machine learning parts of it, so to speak, but they need to talk to the teams that are doing the data science to make sure things are end-to-end implemented from who's managing what piece of it, who's on call for what piece of it, and do we have the tooling for operationalizing things from, the model that was developed to like seeing it through, hardening it enough in production and figuring out when to pull it back. Those are the pieces that I don't think any of the tools have solved for end to end. So what if there's machine learning functionality in the query engine and it's optimized for it? If there is no good user interface to deliver this and manage it end to end, then it still doesn't meet most practical needs around having these models in the first place.
Cool. Makes sense. Next, let's look at projected growth of data teams in 2023. So 80% of the respondents felt that teams are going to grow, which is a positive sign. The question that I have for you folks is, are you able to find the skill sets out there in terms of data engineering?
You can now, I think.
Things are changing.
When was this survey taken? Actually,
thank you. That was going to be my question.
I think it's probably been like 3 months, 3 or 4 months. Yeah, the last few months. Yeah,
it's still hard to find good people that know enough to do it properly and so on. I think there's probably slightly less of a skills gap now, over the last few months. But certainly, it's always difficult. It's always a challenge to find and retain good people and grow your data team, really. And certainly, every client we speak to wants their own data team. They've been constrained by finding those people and so on. Now budgets are an issue. But I'd be curious to know, maybe if this was taken again now, whether this would still be the challenge. But we'll see. It's encouraging. It's encouraging to see that, though.
Cool. What skills do you think you would recommend to data professionals, right, to stay relevant?
Somebody else?
I mean, obviously, you can't go wrong with SQL, but beyond like obviously the obvious. I mean, I think we're finding that more people are kind of refreshing their skills on data modeling, right? Like, and trying to figure out what that means, I think in a more like modern context. Like, are people still relying on facts and dimensions? Are there ways that you can kind of, work around that, that is also just as effective? So I think that's always important, because a lot of times when I come in, a lot of what's been developed, I like to think of as like one-off kind of solutions, where it's like, oh, they developed this table. It really wasn't modeled for anything other than this one solution. And you'll just have like 100 of those, versus trying to build something that's more centralized. So I think that's always somewhere where, people will benefit from, is not just understanding how to write SQL, but how to write, how to build infrastructure in terms of like data that will handle more use cases than just their single use case that they might have at that one moment. I think that's something that people can benefit from. And then also just developing systems that are reliable, maintainable, and have good data quality. Because those, again, it's just really easy to build something these days because of all the solutions, but sometimes harder to think bigger picture and be like, okay, how do I ensure that this data over time, is the same quality? So.
I agree with what Ben is saying, and I'd almost like zoom out a bit and say, it's really framing the problem. Like, what is the business trying to understand from the data? What would be useful? What is table stakes now? What is likely an imminent use case or a need that I also need to kind of suss out of stakeholders before I come up with this data model and then back into the actual design? I think that's the piece that's lacking, or hard to find rather, in the data engineering talent pool that we have. There's really strong talent, no doubt, but it's really connecting the dots and data being sort of glue for triangulating everything that's going on within a company, and being that like strategic lifeblood of that company. If that's the future, then we need to evolve how we think about skill sets and competencies that we look for data teams.
Thanks, Archana. And the last one here, which is basically projected data team budget in 2023, 60%, no change or decreasing, right? So, which is basically goes back to, do more with less kind of a mindset. But when you ask the execs, I think there's definitely a plan to grow the budget, is something that you see here as well. So looks like data teams are going to grow. And a budget's relatively flat or decreasing, but that's more from an individual contributor point of view, I guess. Any thoughts on this? I know. Go ahead.
I mean, are they planning to hire less people, or are they planning to pay less for more people? Based off these numbers, we want to pay less, bigger team.
Supply versus demand, Ben. I think that's how that would work, right?
That's going to have to work.
I'm finding this.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to say, I have a different take on this. It's almost like the ownership of data needs to be a little more distributed than it is today. The kind of view that a data team should single-handedly and in a centralized way solve for all data problems, like maybe it's just that perception has to shift. And each development team or each function within a company, whether it's marketing or finance or sales, also has their role to play in successfully being data driven. And of course, the infra pieces aren't a thing that they can drive per se, but they need to be involved and engaged in making sure that that's successful.
I think really one last thing to say is first of all, they should be definitely spending more money on consultants. I think that's always a good, that's always a good sort of like investment. But no, what I'm finding is that there is money that will be spent, and there is budget available. But it needs, I think we need. The interesting thing for us as a consultancy over the last couple of years, it's to a certain extent, it's been trying to cope with the demand. There's been so much demand for what, and people have just been going for growth at all. Organizations want to spend on growth, increasing revenue, and so on. I think when we do projects now, we're being asked to talk about how can this investment in analytics, how can it save us money? How can it give us more for less? How can it deliver operational efficiency and so on? So projects and investment in making the business more efficient, freeing up resources to do more high value things and so on. There's definitely budget for that available. I think budget for things that are just just speculative or about initiatives with no real contribution towards getting them towards the path of profitability, for example, they're the ones that are being cut. But things that help a business stay alive, save money, and do more with less are definitely where there is still budget to be had to do new projects.
I agree
Sounds
with
good.
Mark on that. It's show the value for what your investments, current investments in data are already bringing, and that value naturally feeds back in. There's more demand and more investment from that for data.
Cool. Let's wrap this up with the next slide. Basically, some of the key findings. Obviously, technology needs to evolve. I'm sure it has to evolve if you want to keep up with the growth. Price and performance being the biggest data-related challenges that we see. Obviously, there are other things as well in terms of evaluating criteria for a data warehouse. Big data investments continue to grow, and basically SQL is king. So these are 4 themes. Any comments on this? Anything else you would like to add? Maybe Mark, you can start with you.
Well,
this is the last one.
Just to wrap up for me, really. I'd say this is all true. Technology to kick up pace of growth, that has definitely been a challenge. Price and performance, I think, will become more of an issue this coming year. But yeah, investments in this area are definitely there. Are still being made if they deliver value. Value is really important now. And SQL, as I said, is maybe the cockroach of technology is a bad way of putting it, but the evergreen and kind of continuing to deliver technology is SQL, even anti-SQL.
Ben, your thoughts?
I'm trying to think. I think a lot of it's going to be the same. I think the theme, Mark, you said it great. I keep hearing everyone say do more with less. That seems to be the theme this year, whether it's looking at solutions that do more for less or people that can do more, so to speak. So I think that's going to continue to kind of be important. And I think the other big thing is people are hopefully going to spend some time realigning the actual business needs with whatever they're doing data wise. I think the last decade it's been cheap, and the call for being data driven has come at any cost at most companies. And I think people are just rationalizing that at this point, like, all right, we can't spend all our money on trying to be data driven. We just need to make sure it makes sense. So
Archana, you get the last word.
All right. Well, I'll try to keep it snappy. First of all, we should reframe the slide to say SQL is monarch or something gender neutral. Jokes aside, I think technology is certainly a piece of how we should look at it, but it goes back to let's double down on people and process to really think about data as driving the impact and value that we see the potential for it.
Thank you. Thank you, folks. I know we've gone over time. I appreciate everybody staying on. And I know you guys all have a very busy schedule, so appreciate you joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Happy holidays and Happy New Year. See you, folks.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks.